Imagine waking up in a world where a single hot week could mean the difference between a full winter pantry and a season of hunger. No hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen. No freezer humming in the garage. No ice dispenser, no cold chain, no delivery truck keeping your milk safe until Tuesday. For more than 99% of human history, this wasn't a hardship people complained about. It was simply the only reality anyone had ever known. And yet, somehow, civilizations fed armies, crossed oceans, survived Arctic winters, and built entire economies around one impossible-sounding problem: how do you keep food from rotting when nature is actively trying to rot it? The answer, it turns out, is one of the most ingenious, dangerous, and occasionally disgusting chapters in human history. And by the end of this story, you'll never look at a jar of pickles, a strip of bacon, or a block of cheese the same way again. Let's go back. Not just decades. Not just centuries. Thousands of years, to the moment our ancestors first realized that food was a ticking clock. For early humans, spoilage wasn't an abstract inconvenience, it was one of the most persistent threats to survival. A successful hunt could bring down an animal weighing hundreds of pounds, far more meat than a small band of people could possibly eat before it turned. Waste that meat, and the next meal was uncertain. Waste it too often, and the tribe didn't survive the season. So somewhere in the deep, unrecorded past, someone made a discovery that would change everything. Meat left near a fire, exposed to smoke and dry heat, lasted longer than meat left in the open air. Nobody understood why. There was no knowledge of bacteria, no concept of moisture content or microbial growth. All they knew was that it worked. And when something works, in a life-or-death situation, you don't ask why. You repeat it. That accidental discovery, smoking, became one of the oldest and most widespread preservation methods on Earth, and it's still with us today, from Texas barbecue joints to Scandinavian fish markets. Smoke does two things at once. It dries out the surface of meat, pulling away the moisture that bacteria need to multiply, and it deposits natural chemical compounds, the same compounds that give smoked food its distinctive flavor, that actually slow bacterial growth. Early humans had, through pure trial and error, stumbled onto a form of chemistry that wouldn't be scientifically explained for thousands of years. But smoking alone wasn't enough. Because while it was happening in forests and river valleys, another, equally powerful method was being discovered almost everywhere on the planet at roughly the same time, independently, by cultures that had no contact with one another whatsoever. Salt. It's easy to overlook something so common today that it sits forgotten in a shaker on every restaurant table. But for most of human history, salt wasn't a seasoning. It was survival. Salt draws water out of food through a process called osmosis, and without that water, the bacteria and molds responsible for decay simply can't function. A piece of meat packed in salt or submerged in a salty brine could last for months instead of days. Fish caught in the North Atlantic could be salted and shipped across entire oceans without spoiling. And this single discovery didn't just feed people, it built empires. Think about that for a moment. Salt determined where cities could grow. It determined which trade routes became rich and which stayed poor. Roman soldiers were sometimes partly paid in salt, and yes, that's genuinely where the word salary comes from, tracing back to the Latin salarium. Venice built extraordinary wealth from its control of Mediterranean salt production. Wars were fought, taxes were despised, and revolutions were sparked, all connected to a mineral most of us don't think twice about today. In 18th century France, the salt tax known as the gabelle was so hated that it became one of the grievances fueling the French Revolution. In more recent history, Mahatma Gandhi's famous Salt March in 1930 was a direct protest against British control over salt production in India, a peaceful defiance that helped ignite the movement toward Indian independence. All of that, traced back to a substance whose real original purpose was keeping food from rotting. But salting and smoking were only two tools in a much larger toolbox. And some of the other tools were, frankly, stranger, and far more surprising, than most people realize. Consider fermentation. To modern ears, the word sounds almost trendy, associated with artisanal kombucha or gourmet kimchi. But fermentation is ancient, and in many ways, it's one of the most remarkable examples of humans essentially domesticating microscopic life without knowing it existed. When cabbage is packed tightly with salt and left to sit, naturally occurring bacteria convert its sugars into lactic acid. That acid lowers the pH to a level where harmful microorganisms simply cannot survive. The result is sauerkraut, a food that can last for months, is rich in nutrients, and, as it turns out, played a hidden role in one of history's most consequential feats of exploration. When Captain James Cook set out on his second voyage around the world in 1772, he carried an enormous supply of sauerkraut aboard his ship. At the time, sailors were dying by the thousands from scurvy, a horrifying disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that could rot the gums, loosen teeth, and reopen old wounds. Nobody fully understood the cause. But Cook, following emerging theories of the era, insisted his crew eat sauerkraut regularly. The result was almost unheard of for long ocean voyages of that century. His crew suffered dramatically fewer scurvy deaths than nearly any other expedition of the age. A humble fermented cabbage dish, born purely out of a need to preserve food through winter, may have quietly helped Britain extend its naval dominance across the globe. And sauerkraut wasn't alone. Across the world, entirely separate cultures arrived at strikingly similar solutions. In Korea, vegetables were packed with salt, chili, and seasonings to create kimchi, sometimes buried underground in clay pots called ongi, where the cool, stable earth temperature allowed slow fermentation to continue safely through the winter months. In East Asia more broadly, soybeans were fermented into products like soy sauce and miso, transforming an otherwise perishable legume into something that could be stored, traded, and used to flavor food for years. In the Middle East and Central Asia, milk was fermented into yogurt and later dried into a hard, shelf-stable substance that could be reconstituted with water on long journeys. Time and time again, wildly different cultures, with no contact, no shared language, no shared trade routes, landed on remarkably similar biological solutions to the exact same problem. It's one of the more astonishing patterns in human history: give people the same threat, spoilage, and they will independently invent the same defense, fermentation, again and again, on opposite sides of the planet. Milk itself deserved special attention, because milk might be one of the most spoilage-prone foods our ancestors ever had to deal with. Fresh milk, left out in a warm climate, can turn dangerous within hours. And yet dairy farming stretches back thousands of years. So how did ancient societies manage it? The answer is cheese, and it might be one of the most ingenious, accidental, discoveries in food history. Ancient herders likely stored milk in pouches made from animal stomachs, which still contained natural enzymes called rennet. Those enzymes caused the milk to separate into solid curds and liquid whey. What started as a storage mistake turned into a revelation: the solid curds, once salted, pressed, and aged, could last for months or even years, far longer than the milk they came from. Entire cultures built culinary identities around this transformation: Parmesan in Italy, aged for years in enormous wheels; Roquefort in France, aged in limestone caves where a specific type of mold gave it its distinctive blue veins; hard, dense cheeses in Switzerland designed specifically to survive brutal alpine winters. Every wedge of cheese in a modern grocery store carries within it a direct, unbroken line back to a preservation crisis solved thousands of years ago. Now, here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because not every civilization relied primarily on salt or fermentation. Some turned instead to a resource so obvious it's almost strange we don't think about it more: the sun. Drying, or dehydration, might be the single oldest food preservation method of all, older even than controlled fire in some interpretations, because it requires no technology whatsoever. Simply expose food to sun and wind, and moisture evaporates, leaving behind a product that molds and bacteria cannot easily colonize. In the Andes Mountains of South America, indigenous peoples developed an extraordinary process for preserving potatoes called chuño. Potatoes were left outside overnight at extreme high-altitude temperatures, allowed to freeze solid, then trampled underfoot the next day to squeeze out the moisture released by the freezing process. This freeze-drying cycle was repeated for several days until the potatoes had transformed into a hard, lightweight, almost indestructible substance that could be stored for years, some accounts suggest even decades, without spoiling. Long before freeze-drying became a modern industrial process used by space agencies and camping food companies, the Inca had already invented it, using nothing but altitude, cold nights, and human feet. Across the ocean, Native American communities developed their own extraordinary preservation technique, pemmican. Dried meat, often bison or deer, was pounded into a coarse powder, then mixed with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries. The resulting mixture could be packed into pouches, often made from animal hide, and would remain edible for years, even in extreme conditions. Pemmican wasn't just food. It was calorie-dense, portable, nearly weightless compared to its energy content, and virtually immune to spoilage, making it one of the most effective survival foods ever devised by any culture, anywhere. Centuries later, European fur traders and explorers adopted pemmican wholesale, recognizing that indigenous peoples had already solved a logistical problem European expeditions were struggling with. Arctic explorers, including some of the earliest attempts to reach the North and South Poles, relied on pemmican-based rations, directly borrowing from techniques indigenous North American cultures had refined long before European contact. But drying and freezing only worked in certain climates. What about places where the sun wasn't reliable, or where sugar, rather than salt, was the more available resource? This brings us to one of the sweeter, quite literally, preservation methods in history, sugaring. Just like salt, sugar can draw moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment hostile to bacteria. Fruit preserved in heavy sugar syrup, or cooked down into jams and marmalades, could last through winter months when fresh fruit simply didn't exist. In medieval and early modern Europe, sugar was extraordinarily expensive, often treated as a luxury reserved for the wealthy, which meant that elaborate preserved fruits, candied peels, and sugared confections became status symbols as much as practical foodstuffs. It wasn't until sugar production expanded dramatically, tied tragically to the transatlantic slave trade and the brutal plantation systems of the Caribbean and the Americas, that sugar preservation became accessible to ordinary households rather than just aristocrats. It's a sobering reminder that the story of food preservation isn't only one of clever human ingenuity. It's also tangled up with some of history's darkest chapters, where the demand for preserving and flavoring food helped drive systems of exploitation that caused immense human suffering. Fat, too, played its own quiet role. In a method sometimes called potting, cooked meat, often duck, goose, or pork, would be packed tightly into a container and completely submerged under a layer of solid fat. Once that fat cooled and hardened, it created an airtight seal, cutting off the oxygen that spoilage bacteria depend on. This is the same basic principle behind French confit, where meat is slow-cooked in its own fat and then stored beneath that same fat for months. Long before vacuum sealing existed, cooks across Europe had already discovered that fat itself could act as a natural, edible seal against the outside world. And then there was the earth itself. Root cellars, simple underground chambers dug into hillsides or beneath houses, took advantage of one of nature's most reliable constants. A few feet below the surface, soil temperature remains remarkably stable year-round, far cooler than the air above during summer, and far warmer than the air above during the depths of winter. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets could be stored in these cellars for months, buried in sand or straw to further regulate moisture and temperature. Apples, too, could last an astonishingly long time in a well-managed root cellar, sometimes remaining edible well into the following spring. For much of rural history, right up through the early 20th century in many parts of the world, the root cellar wasn't a quaint, old-fashioned curiosity. It was the single most important piece of food infrastructure a family owned. No electricity, no moving parts, no fuel required, just a hole in the ground, engineered with remarkable intuitive precision by people who had never taken a single physics class. But what if you wanted actual cold? Not just cool earth, but real, hard ice, in the middle of summer. This is where the story gets genuinely astonishing, because long before mechanical refrigeration existed, an entire global industry emerged around harvesting, transporting, and selling natural ice, and one man in particular turned it into an empire. His name was Frederic Tudor, a Boston businessman who, in the early 19th century, had what most of his contemporaries considered an almost laughably absurd idea: cut blocks of ice from frozen New England ponds during the winter, and ship them, by sailing vessel, across warm ocean waters, to tropical destinations, before they melted. People openly mocked him. Newspapers called it Tudor's folly. His early shipments were disasters, arriving as little more than puddles of seawater and dwindling ice fragments. But Tudor refused to give up. He experimented relentlessly with insulation, eventually discovering that packing ice in sawdust, a cheap byproduct from New England's booming lumber industry, dramatically slowed melting during long voyages. By the 1830s and 1840s, Tudor's ice was reaching Caribbean islands, and astonishingly, all the way to Calcutta, India, a journey of roughly 4 months by sea, with a significant percentage of the ice still intact upon arrival. What had once been mocked as an impossible fantasy became one of the most profitable trade businesses of the era. At the height of what became known as the ice trade, New England ponds were harvested by the hundreds of thousands of tons annually, cut into blocks by horse-drawn saws, stored in massive insulated icehouses, and shipped around the entire world, to London, to New Orleans, to Australia, to India, all before anyone had built a single mechanical refrigerator. Ordinary households, too, gradually gained access to this frozen commodity. By the mid to late 19th century, iceboxes, wooden cabinets lined with tin or zinc, with a compartment for a large block of ice, became common in wealthier and eventually middle-class homes across America and Europe. An iceman would make regular rounds through neighborhoods, delivering fresh blocks of ice by horse-drawn cart, refilling the icebox before the previous block had fully melted. It was, in many ways, the direct ancestor of the modern refrigerator, right down to the shape of the appliance and its placement in the kitchen, except the cooling came not from electricity and compressed gas, but from a slowly melting chunk of a frozen New England pond, and from the ambition of a man everyone had once written off as a fool. Yet for all of this ingenuity, the salt, the smoke, the fermentation, the sugar, the fat, the root cellars, the astonishing global trade in frozen pond water, preserving food before refrigeration was never without risk. And this is the part of the story that's easy to romanticize, but shouldn't be. Preservation methods, for all their cleverness, were far from perfectly reliable. Salted meat could still spoil if not salted thoroughly or stored properly. Fermented foods, if contaminated by the wrong strains of bacteria rather than the beneficial ones, could turn dangerous rather than safe. And one of the most feared dangers of all came from improperly preserved foods sealed away from oxygen, a bacterium capable of producing one of the most lethal toxins known to science, thriving specifically in low oxygen, improperly preserved conditions. Long before anyone understood the microbiology behind it, people simply learned, through tragedy and hard experience, which foods, prepared which ways, tended to make people gravely ill, and which methods, refined over countless generations, could mostly be trusted. Food preservation before the modern era wasn't a solved science. It was an ongoing, high-stakes negotiation with invisible biological forces that nobody could see, name, or fully explain, using only intuition, tradition, and the accumulated painful lessons of those who had gotten it wrong before. And this uncertainty is precisely what makes the story's next chapter so remarkable, because it centers on one man who, without any understanding of germ theory or microbiology whatsoever, managed to invent a preservation method so effective that its basic principle is still used in kitchens worldwide today. His name was Nicolas Appert, a French confectioner and chef living in the early 19th century. In 1795, the French government, desperate to solve the chronic problem of feeding Napoleon's armies on long campaigns far from home, offered a substantial cash prize to anyone who could develop a reliable new method of food preservation. Appert spent over a decade experimenting, using a method that seems almost obvious in hindsight, but had never been systematically tested before. He sealed food inside glass jars, then submerged those sealed jars in boiling water for extended periods. He had no idea why it worked. The scientific understanding of bacteria and sterilization wouldn't arrive until Louis Pasteur's research, decades later, in the 1860s. But Appert's method simply, empirically, worked. Sealed, boiled food resisted spoilage in a way nothing before it ever had. In 1810, Appert was awarded the prize, and his technique, soon adapted from glass jars into more durable tin canisters by British inventor Peter Durand, became the foundation of what we now call canning. The implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, food could be preserved not for weeks or months, but potentially for years, in a form that was lightweight, transportable, and required no ongoing maintenance like salting, smoking, or ice replenishment. Canned food transformed military logistics, allowing armies to be supplied across vast distances. It transformed naval exploration, giving ships the ability to carry provisions on multi-year voyages into uncharted, resource-scarce regions like the Arctic and Antarctic. And eventually, decades later, it transformed the ordinary household kitchen, laying the groundwork for the massive food industry that would eventually give rise to supermarkets stocked with shelf-stable goods in every direction you looked. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange this progression really is. For thousands of years, humans preserved food using methods rooted in direct, tangible interaction with nature: salt from the earth, smoke from fire, cold from mountain caves and frozen ponds, sun from the sky. And then, in the span of barely a century, that entire relationship transformed. Appert's boiling jars gave way to industrial canning. Frederic Tudor's ice trade gave way, eventually, to mechanical refrigeration, first appearing in commercial settings in the mid to late 19th century, and only reaching widespread residential use in the 1920s and 1930s. Within a single human lifetime, someone could be born into a world where keeping food required root cellars, smokehouses, and blocks of pond ice delivered by horse-drawn cart, and could die in a world with an electric compressor humming quietly in their own kitchen, keeping food cold at the flip of a switch. And yet, here's the thing worth sitting with as this story comes to a close. Almost everything we associate with old-fashioned food, bacon, cured ham, aged cheese, pickles, sauerkraut, dried fruit, smoked salmon, jam, yogurt, none of it exists because anyone was chasing a particular flavor for its own sake. Every single one of those foods exists because, at some point in history, a group of people were staring down the very real threat of starvation, and needed a way to make food last just a little bit longer. Flavor was, in almost every case, a fortunate byproduct of survival. The tangy sharpness of sauerkraut, the deep umami of aged cheese, the smoky richness of cured meat, these aren't just culinary choices. They're fossils, in a sense, preserved traces of solutions our ancestors engineered under genuine pressure, without laboratories, without microscopes, and without any real understanding of why their methods worked, only the hard-earned certainty that they did. The next time you open your refrigerator without a second thought, it might be worth remembering just how recent, and how extraordinary, that convenience actually is. For nearly all of human history, keeping food from rotting wasn't a background process handled quietly by a machine in the corner of the kitchen. It was one of the central, defining challenges of daily survival, one that shaped trade routes, sparked revolutions, launched global industries, and, quietly, gave us some of the most beloved foods in the world today. So here's a question worth sitting with: of all the preservation methods in this story, the salt, the smoke, the ice, the sun, the fermentation, which one do you think you could have actually figured out yourself, with nothing but instinct and desperation, if your family's survival depended on it? Let us know in the comments.